Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about modality. I'm calling this part one because I do plan to add to this later, but I think in this video you'll get a good overview of what is meant by modality and the related term stance. So as an example, think of two young children arguing over something, right? And then they may come up with something like this. So one says, you broke it. And the other one says, did not, and did do, didn't, and then finally, you must have broken it, you had it last. So the children are arguing, but this is not a very, let's say, not a very complex form of argument, right? They're just going back and forth. You did it, I didn't. You did it, I didn't, right? You broke it, I did not break it. You did too break it, like that, right? They just go back and forth. We see a little bit of a change in line 5 where L says you must have broken it, and so they're doing something different with that must, right? Trying to increase the certainty, or at least show the certainty in a different way that M broke something, right? So this is certainly possible, but it's not a very complex form for the most part, right? You did it, I didn't, you did it, I didn't. Often, of course, we do things differently, right? We use our language, but we're not always as firm or certain as the children. We can be firm, but we can be tentative, right? More hesitant. We can claim things quite directly or suggest things, right? We do this often when we argue, like the children were doing, but really any time that we talk and we are interacting with someone, we're going to think about how strong or tentative we want to be as we communicate. So the linguistic term used for this is a stance, right? We take a stance when we use language. We can have quite a strong stance or a weaker stance, an authoritative stance or a more egalitarian stance. The excellent quotation here sums this up very well. The references are at the end, as always. Stance is the speaker's or writer's feeling, attitude, perspective, or position as enacted in the discourse. So in the discourse, in the language that he or she is writing, the language that they are speaking, people show their stance, which can include those things like being firm or tentative and so on. How do we do this? That's the discussion today. How, or at least what is one of the ways that we show our stance? This is modality, right? We show it, one of the ways that we show our stance is through modality. We use modality to show things, as it says here, to show how probable something is, how usual something is, how obvious something is, or to show our stance about how obliged someone is to do something, right? How strong or weak the advice I'm giving you, the obligation is. We use modality for that. Now, you probably know the basics of this, right? If you compare sentence 1, he went home, with sentence 2, he might have gone home, you will immediately see that there is something different about those two, that in number 1, the person says he went home. This is presented as certain. This is presented as absolute. This is presented as true. I'm using a few of the different terms that you may find if you research this, that this is presented as being an absolute. That's quite a common way of saying it. Number 1, he went home, this is absolute. As opposed to number 2, it's no longer absolute. He might have gone home. We have that might there that suggests that it may not be true. What's important to remember here is we're not talking about whether the person is correct or not. They may be mistaken. Someone says he went home. They may be mistaken. They may have been mistaken, or they may be lying. That's possible. We're not talking about reality here. We're talking about how the person chooses to present reality, right? The person says he went home, I may be lying. If I say he went home, I may be lying, or I may be wrong. But when I say he went home, at least as far as the language goes, it seems that I am very certain that I am presenting this as being absolutely true, whereas if I say he might have gone home, I'm presenting this as being somewhat tentative. That's what modality does. It goes between those two absolutes of the two ends of this would be he went home or he didn't go home, right? You've got absolutely positive, he went home, absolutely negative, he didn't go home. Modality allows us to move the certainty of that somewhere along the continuum between absolutely true and absolutely, or absolutely positive, I should say, and absolutely negative. Positive and negative in terms of grammar. Again, not true. We can't say whether it's true or not in reality. We don't know what actually happened. How do we do this? There are three ways that modality is presented. These are the three things I want to tell you about today. Number one, modal finites. Number two, mood adjuncts. Number three, interpersonal grammatical metaphors. Modal finites, you are probably most familiar with, something like she may be camping, right? If you ask me, where's your sister? My sister likes to go camping, right? Where's your sister? She may be camping. So I didn't say she is camping. She is camping would be very certain, very absolute. There's no modality. If you say she is camping, there's no modality there. Once you say she may be camping, I've reduced the certainty by using the modal finite may. A mood adjunct is you're doing the same, it's got the same purpose, but you're doing it a different way, right? You say she's probably camping. Here, again, we're not certain if she's camping or not. We've introduced some doubt by saying probably. Probably is a mood adjunct. And finally, the one with the long name, but it's not particularly complex, an interpersonal grammatical metaphor. When you say, I think she's camping, we have the same information presented, she's camping, but then doubt is introduced by saying, I think. So I think here is an interpersonal grammatical metaphor. So let's look at each of these in a bit more detail. Modal finites are things like this. The dog might be sleeping. I will learn to play piano. It should be on the shelf. I left it there when I last used it. You should quit vaping. Things like that, right? Now, you may be saying that these are modal verbs. That's true. It's absolutely fine to call them modal verbs. They come in pairs. May, might, shall, should, will, would, can, could, and must. Must doesn't have a pair anymore, at least. I understand that historically there was a pair must and mote, M-O-T-E, but nobody uses that anymore, right? So you've got the modal verbs, and then those ones that are very similar, sometimes they're called semi-modals, things like saying have to instead of must, need to instead of must, ought to instead of should, things like that, right? But let's stick with the modal verbs, or as I call them here, modal finites. Now, I'm not going to go into that again here. If you want to call them modal verbs, fine. I prefer, for precision, modal finites. If you want to know why, you can look at a video I previously made about the interpersonal metafunction to see why that term finite is probably preferable in terms of being both accurate and more descriptive. These are the modals, right? The modal verbs, we use them to introduce, as said before, probability, usuality, certainty, and so on. Mood adjuncts. Now, here is one that, of course, you probably know how to use these, but in my experience, my students don't tend to know the term. They don't know maybe how to describe this, right? They speak and write English fluently, whether they are native or non-native speakers, but they don't know the term. Mood adjunct. So this is another way that we take that stand, but make it less certain, make it indefinite, make it more hesitant, right? Adjunct means extra or optional, like an adjunct in the army is an assistant, or an adjunct professor is not yet a full professor. So an adjunct is optional information, and mood refers to grammatical mood, which again, you can see in that video. I just listed the interpersonal metafunction, but I will explain that briefly here. So what's going on? Someone says something like, you're always smoking in front of the building. You're always smoking in front of the building. We have the subject here is you. And we have the verb are smoking. That is the mood block. That's where we get the mood from. Remember, there are three moods in English: declarative, interrogative, and imperative. all we need is the subject and the verb to know the mood, right? Once you have you are, you know it's declarative. If it was interrogative, it would be are you smoking in front of the building? And if it was imperative, you wouldn't have the subject or any auxiliary verbs. It'd be odd to say it, but the imperative mood here would be smoke in front of the building. So mood comes from just knowing the position of the subject and the verb. You are or are you, or neither of them appear, and you just say smoke. So that's the mood block. So the mood adjunct is when you put something with that, right next to it or even between the two parts of the mood block, and you put something there as an adjunct, as optional information, and the purpose of that is to introduce some hesitancy, some doubt, some form of modality. So you see what's happening here is the person has said, you are always smoking. So this is being quite assertive, right? You are always smoking. Always is the mood adjunct. You see how that is, sometimes people say, well, isn't that always here is just an adverb of time. It's just telling us when it happens. Well, yes, it's telling us about when it happens, but you should see also that it's introducing that element of modality, because think of how you would reduce that, right? If it was absolute, you'd say you're smoking in front of the building or you're not smoking in front of the building. But to move it along that continuum, we say things like you are always smoking in front of the building, often smoking in front of the building, sometimes smoking in the front of the building, and so on. So a mood adjunct fulfills that same role as a modal finite in that it increases, or rather reduces, I was going to say increases the amount of modality, or you could say reduces the amount of certainty, reduces something from being absolute to being less than absolute. Other examples of mood adjuncts include things like this. We often meet in the hallway. Now here, notice that we have the mood block comes from the subject. Subject is in blue, the verb is in red. The mood block is we meet, and you have the adjunct often appears there. Here, it's probably time to leave. Here, the mood adjunct probably appears after the mood block. With of course, we have the mood adjunct appearing before the mood block. So you see that all the positions are possible here. The adjunct can appear in the middle, as with often in number 1. The adjunct can appear after the mood block, as with probably in number 2. Or it can appear before, as in of course with number 3, right? I think of course is for me at least, until I started learning about this, of course was sort of, what's the word? I didn't quite understand why we ever bothered saying of course, right? Or at least I didn't know how to describe it. Think of this, right? If someone says, do you want to have lunch? Do you want to have lunch? You can say yes, right? Do you want to have lunch? Yes. Why would we then bother if someone says, do you want to have lunch? Why would you answer, of course I do, of course. Of course just means yes, right? Doesn't it mean, because either way I'm going, right? Do you want to have lunch? Yes. Do you want to have lunch? Of course. Both of them mean I am responding positively to your question about lunch. But of course, as a mood adjunct, adds that element of modality. If you think back to the second or third slide, where it said that one thing's modality does is mark the obviousness of something. You say, do you want to have lunch? I say yes. No modality there. You say, do you want to have lunch? I say, of course I do. Of course marks this as obvious. Perhaps I want to show you that I'm very happy to have lunch with you. And so, of course, I could say, yeah, I'd be happy to have lunch. But saying, of course, has that same element in this, has that same function, right? It marks the obviousness of my response. Why would you even think that I wouldn't have lunch with you? You know I like you. Of course I want to have lunch with you. So, of course, is a mood adjunct, and as I said, a particularly interesting one and easier to describe when you know words like mood adjunct and modality and obviousness. The subject typically appears before the verb. Here we have another example where the mood adjunct appears between the subject and the verb, right? The subject and the verb with typically between it. The final example here that I want to show you is doing something even more complex. Not complex to produce, because if we're good speakers of English, we know how to do this and we do it all the time, but complex in terms of how to describe it. If you ask me if she's going to win the race, I could say, Nene will probably win, right? So we have the subject, Nene, and we have the verb win. But now I have two elements here. We have we have will, which is a modal finite, as I first described, which is quite certain, right? Nana will win the race. I'm presenting this as being quite certain, as opposed to Nana will probably. So I say Nana will, and it's quite strong, and then I say probably with a mood adjunct, and I reduce the certainty again, right? So it's up and down, right? Nana will probably. I'm talking to you and I want to present my opinion, my stance, as precisely as possible. It is, of course, possible for me to use both the mood adjunct probably and the modal finite will to try to get things just right. If I say Nana will win, sounds quite strong. I think that's too certain. So I can use both will and probably to get the modality just right along that continuum. We're very good at doing this, right? Finally, interpersonal grammatical metaphor, which, as I wanted to assure you here, it's a long name, but I think it's not very complicated. I was sort of scared of it at first myself because of that long name, but it's reasonably simple to understand what's going on here. So you ask me about someone and I say, oh yeah, I think that's Johnson. I think that's Johnson, right? My friend Johnson. I think that's Johnson. He's far away. I can't quite see, right? So I say, I think that's Johnson. What is going on here? We have what looks to be two subjects and two verbs here, right? We have I think, which I is the subject and think is a verb. But then we also have that, which is a subject, and the is, which is a verb. Subject, verb, subject, verb. How do we reconcile what's going on here? Well, you have to realize that the I think here is metaphorical. It just means probably. This is where the name interpersonal grammatical metaphor comes from. So it's a metaphor because it doesn't mean what it says, right? Metaphors typically are described something like that, where you say one thing but we mean another. I say I think, but I'm not referring to the literal thinking process, the cognitive function involved with coming up with thoughts and ideas. I'm not talking, I think that's Johnson. The I think is metaphorical thinking. The metaphor is interpreted as just meaning probably. So when I say I think that's Johnson, although I and think are in fact a subject and a verb, they're not the ones that are important for the content here. The content comes from that is Johnson. And all I mean when I say I think that's Johnson is, I mean that's probably Johnson. So instead of being absolute, that's Johnson, I'm reducing the certainty a bit, right? That's probably Johnson. So I think. So the interpersonal grammatical metaphor here is I think, right? It's a metaphor because I don't say exactly what I mean. It's grammatical because it's the grammar function of I think should not be taken as the real subject and verb here. Interpersonal because I'm using that metaphor between my person speaking and your person listening. I'm using that metaphor in order to create exactly the right amount of certainty in order to shape the modality as accurately as I can. Think of it as a metaphor. Primarily, interpersonal grammatical is not so important. Consider that I think in this case metaphorically just means probably, not literal thinking. Unlike in this sentence at the bottom of the page, if someone says, I think about language a lot, here I think is not a metaphor. Here the person who says, I think about language a lot is referring to thinking in its literal meaning, the cognitive processing. It's hard to describe, it's hard to give at least for me, to give a definition of thinking. But here the person is referring to literal thinking. My brain is doing its work. The neurons are firing and I'm processing something to come up with ideas. I think about language a lot the I think does not mean probably. You can see that because you can't change the word I think to probably. You'd just have probably about language a lot. That doesn't work. Whereas with I think that's Johnson, you can change the words I think for probably and it makes sense, right? I think that's Johnson, probably that's Johnson. I think is a metaphor. I think about language a lot. I think is literal thinking here. It's not a metaphor. It does not mean probably. A couple of more examples of interpersonal grammatical metaphors. So I don't believe that is true. I've highlighted believe here. I think, well, as always, you can pause, but this might be a time to pause for a few seconds to think about how believe is metaphorical here. And now if you've done that and unpaused, you can see, I think you'll have seen that believe here is again a metaphor just meaning probably. When someone says, I don't believe that is true, they mean that is probably not true. So believe here is an interpersonal grammatical metaphor. Whereas if you say something like she believes in magic, here believes is the literal meaning of belief, to have an awareness and certainty, or an awareness and acceptance of magic. In number two, believe is not a metaphor. That's the meaning of believe in its dictionary sense, its literal sense. Whereas in number one, believe is an interpersonal grammatical metaphor. You can do that with a couple of more examples, right? Pause as you will. Is think in number three a metaphor or not? Here you should be seeing that this is not a metaphor, right? The person is saying, the children are so noisy that I can't think. The children are so noisy that I can't use my brain to do its work. Again, whatever the definition of think is, the person is using think to mean literal thinking. My brain doesn't work because of the children's noise. That is not a metaphor. Number four, however, we do see a metaphor again. Think of, try to produce a sentence that replaces the part in red. I find it likely that. This is the kind of thing that you might see in a film when the judge delivers a verdict, right? And she or he'll say something like, I find it likely that the defendant did commit these crimes. You know that the person is just changing the modality, not saying the defendant did commit these crimes, which is absolutely certain, but instead says the defendant probably did commit these crimes, introducing an element of modality with an interpersonal grammatical metaphor. So those are the three ways that we introduce modality in order to modify our stance, right? We use modal finites, we use mood adjuncts, and we use interpersonal grammatical metaphors. It can be useful to have a way of describing the level of modality. Before I told you, I said something like, it's absolutely true, he did go. It's absolutely not true, he didn't go. Or at least it's absolutely positive, he did go. Absolutely negative, he did not go. And that there's a continuum between, like a line. There's no discrete point. It's not like a light switch. A light is on or it's off, right? It's binary. Here we have a continuum. So how do we describe modality? Well, sometimes the best we can do is to just rely on our intuition and describe modality as being high, median, or low, right? High modality, when you say you must read the book, as opposed to you should read the book being median, and you might read the book as being a low modality, or always, if you want to look at must, should, and might are modal finites, as opposed to always, often, and rarely, which are mood adjuncts. You could describe them in the same way. If you say something always happens, something often happens, or something rarely happens, you're describing something as being high, median, or low modality. A lot of internet sources will say high, medium, and low. I'm using the term median here because that's what Thompson uses in his book, and Thompson's book is very good and very detailed, so I follow his advice. Thompson says median, so I use median. high, median, or low modality, right? You must go, you could describe that as, so if someone said you must go, you could describe must as being a high modality modal finite. If someone said she rarely interrupts, you could say that's a low modality mood adjunct. We've got to take care to get these terms right. Let's try it with an example here from the book referenced in the bottom corner. Here is a student, Cherie, has been asked to write to describe the qualities of a good teacher. So I'll leave you to read it. I don't think I need to read it to you. I can pause while you read it, and you would look for the modality here. I'll pause. Okay, how would you describe this? So you could look for the examples of modals, must, should. We have needs to, which is a, as I called it, a semi-modal, but I think you can see that it fulfills the same function. A good teacher must be understanding to all children. So we have modality presented with the modal finites and the semi-modals, and then we have, I think, in the second last line, that's what I think a good teacher should be like. So if you were to describe these as you could describe them individually, but when it comes to describing them as a whole, it's okay, I think, to just summarize them, right? Mostly I see here high modality, must, needs to. Especially notice that the child, Cherie, uses high modality when she's talking about, when she's writing about the things that she says a teacher, about a teacher's behavior and about a teacher's actions, right? When she's talking about the teacher's actions, the teacher must speak like this, the teacher must work like that. When it comes to the later part, and the modality is more of a, I'd say, median modality, should, I think, and should. Notice the child is writing about something different here. The child is writing about a suggestion for how the teacher could reward people. And when stating her own opinion, that's what I think a teacher should be like. When Cherie summarizes her whole description of the teacher's quality, she's presents this all as being less certain. So she writes it up. So I would describe this as when, to make a simple summary, I'd say when Cherie describes a teacher's necessary qualities, she uses high modality for the most part. But when Cherie summarizes this and restates that this is her own opinion, she uses more median modality by saying that's what I think a good teacher should be like. If she wanted to continue being quite strong, the last sentence would say that's what a good teacher must be like. So we see how she backs off a bit. So now, why did she back off a bit? I don't know. This is not psychology. We're not trying to say that we know for certain what's happening in people's brains, right? We have no way of knowing that. But as far as the language presentation, Cherie first presents herself as quite certain, quite assertive, high modality, modal finites. But when she summarizes at the end, she moves to median modality, modal finites, and the interpersonal grammatical metaphor, I think. That's how you might use your knowledge of modality to provide an overview of a bit of text or a bit of discourse. Here are the references. The first one, using functional grammar, is excellent, but unfortunately for many of us difficult to find. And then the other two are much more commonly available, I find. Thompson especially is quite commonly available, and you'll probably find newer editions than the one I've cited here. Good. Thank you very much for your time. Take care.